Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Ep.9 Response to Stuff You Should Know.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back. My name is Brent, and that guy is Mariano Alvarez. We want to welcome you guys to episode 9 of the Dog Trainers Podcast. Now, today we have a special treat for you guys. We are actually commenting for the very, very first time on another podcast called Stuff You Should Know, and they had a specific episode called How Dog Training Works. One of my clients actually sent this to me, and I actually listened to it, and I thought it was pretty interesting. So I shot it over to Mariano, and we decided to make this whole episode about our commentary on that episode. So Mariano, what did you think about the episode?
Yeah, so first things first with the episode is it was well done. I mean, I definitely like Chuck and Josh, and I think that after listening to it, because I wasn't quite privy to the Stuff You Should Know podcast, but after listening to that episode, I looked around at a couple other episodes that are just, it's not a dog, it's just based on whatever else they were talking about. And they're funny guys. And, there was just a couple things with this episode in particular, because it deals with dog training, that it was well done. And you can tell, especially in certain areas, that they did some good research, but in other areas, maybe not so much. So I really wanted to clear some stuff up because I know that they're more popular. And I think that it's important, for somebody with such a large audience, that the information that be out there be accurate. And I want to be clear from the jump. I don't necessarily think that it was like intentional, but nonetheless, it's not necessarily the most accurate information out there.
Right. I think they kind of gave a very common, to the public, it's a very common dichotomy of, there's only two forms of dog training, and you're either in this camp or you're either in this camp. Which, funny enough, a lot of dog owners actually feel this way. So I pretty much, I don't necessarily think this necessarily educated people as much as it may have already just expressed thoughts and philosophies that people already had in their mind. So what I want to do in our podcast, if we can, is I want to educate people on kind of like the context, the full spectrum of things. And definitely, I want to praise them for the things that are up to date and modern ways of thinking, because things like dominance dog training and alpha roles and alpha leader and all that stuff, even though there are some novice dog trainers who still believe in those things, it's not it is not the common flow of dog training or the common movement that is here right now in the very, very present day. It is just a small portion of it.
Yeah, I think that was probably I wouldn't say biggest gripe, but that was what I wanted to make sure that we outlined kind of right from the get-go, because when they talk about these things, they pretty clearly outline positive reinforcement in a way, or pure positive training anyway, in a way that I think is accurate to the whole ideology and the thought process behind that training, methodology. But when it came to, they were calling it like dominance training and those things that you were saying, like an alpha roll, and there was the like scruff shake and other things like that.
Yeah.
I have no problem with people comparing. I mean, people do that all the time. It's always great for conversation, and ultimately, it's good to hash out ideas to decide whose is like which is best for the dog. But and I don't even have an issue with these guys having like a preference, because I think that they pretty clearly had a preference for positive reinforcement, which is fine.
Right.
I mean, that's totally okay. But
because definitely, well, given the two, that seems the obviously
right,
the better choice. But I do want to say that these guys, both Chuck and Josh, they love their animals and their dogs so much. And usually, in circumstances like this, what we always see is any type of disagreement, in philosophies or ideologies, because in both camps, as they talk about, they can all argue their points, but these guys really love their animals, and I know that their intentions were to definitely make life better for animals. So if there was anybody who may be mistreating their dogs or subscribing to some of these really outdated methods, I know at the bottom of their hearts, they just really wanted to make sure that lives were better for those dogs.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. I just, where I'm coming from is I understand that, and I'm giving them all of that leeway. I totally get it, and I hold nothing against them. My only thing was, we kind of framed it in the beginning, and then we can jump right into the actual content of the podcast. Was just when framing it, if you're going to debate ideas, any two ideas, you have to come to the debate with the actual ideas. You can't come
Yeah.
with one as it is and the other one in like a negative light where it's kind of not real, because then of course the first one sounds better. So if
Yeah.
you're confident that you're better, then bring the actual two ideas to the forefront as they are, and then we can have honest dialogue. I think that's going to help dogs.
Yeah, 100%. I think that'll help maybe that'll help educate people who might be on the fence or don't know what to believe.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Where should we get started?
Well, let's dive right in. So I think the first thing, that me and you talked about that I know we wanted to bring up, and I kind of wanted to hear you riff about it a little bit,
Mhm.
was they talk about positive reinforcement and they were talking about it as an operant conditioning technique. But
Mhm.
I know that you and I were kind of getting into the other three, so I wanted to hear you jump on that a bit.
Yeah. So, the term positive reinforcement, it went from being a scientific, behavioral, a step in a behavioral teaching and learning process to starting becoming a marketing term, right? And this is probably over the last 20 years. This has happened to this extent, and so. They mentioned something in the first third of the podcast where they were talking about how positive reinforcement is a scientifically proven operant conditioning technique.
Mhm,
And then, later down the line, they end up talking about B.F. Skinner. They end up kind of like putting B.F. Skinner a little bit in a bad light, who's the guy who created the operant conditioning quadrants, right? Who like is known for that.
mhm.
So it was a little bit interesting, but for those of you guys who are listening who may not know what operant conditioning is, you've definitely heard these terminologies before. For example, the term positive reinforcement, but there's three other ones. There is negative reinforcement, and then there's a punishment side of the spectrum. There's positive punishment, and then there's negative punishment. And one thing they did really, really well in this podcast is breaking down the existence of these four. However, they didn't really explain them completely, at least in context as a whole. They kind of explain them throughout the whole thing. So, what we'll do is I'll teach you guys a little bit about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, positive reinforcement. So, in operant conditioning, the term positive and the words negative have more of a mathematical representation where you're either adding something or subtracting something from an equation. So positive means to add something to the equation, and negative means to subtract something from the equation. When we say the word reinforcement, what we're talking about is how to increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future. And when we talk about the word punishment, is how do we decrease the likelihood of that behavior occurring again in the future, right? And also, we're going to be working with two forces. We're working with things that are desirable for the dog, and we're dealing with things that are undesirable to the dog. Now, undesirable, this is the interesting part, is undesirable doesn't always have to mean pain or like aggression or something bad for the dog, right? It just needs to be something that the dog perceives as something they don't like. So positive reinforcement is very simple to understand. I add something to reinforce a behavior. An example of this would be giving a dog a treat if they did something right. Boom, positive reinforcement. Super easy to understand. One that's a little bit tougher is negative reinforcement, which is removing something undesirable to reinforce a good behavior or decision that the dog made, right? An example for that for humans would be like, let's say a kid was grounded for 2 weeks. His parents noticed that he was really trying hard to do better, to prove to his parents that he's sorry and remorseful for what he did. And what they do is they take away 1 week of being grounded, and that's an example of reinforcing that good decisions that he was making and that change he made in his life. So that's one example. When we deal with punishments, positive punishment, again, the word positive means to add something to the equation. So we're adding something. In this case, we're adding something undesirable to punish, which means reduce the probability that something will happen again in the future. So that's the traditional like correction or reprimand, right, in dog training. So we can call that a correction. Um, and then the last one, which is called negative punishment, is where we are removing something. Negative means remove something desirable to the learner in order to punish them. So this sounds pretty similar to like a penalty, right? Or like taking the kids' toys away because they did something wrong. So this is called negative punishment. So that's the full operant conditioning spectrum. And then one thing that they brought up is they brought up the Monks of New Skeet, which I've read 3 of their books before while I was a younger dog trainer, and again, they kind of bash a little bit on the Monks of New Skeet because they don't agree with their methods. I guess a couple things, and by no means am I going to defend 100% their methods, but the idea is the Monks of New Skeet are also very intricate breeders of certain German Shepherd bloodlines, right? So the Monks of New Skeet have bloodlines that are great for service dogs. They have great protection dog bloodlines. They have different varying degrees of bloodlines that they have in their German shepherds. And as a dog trainer for many years, any dog trainer will understand there are certain types of dogs or bloodlines that actually need to be trained a little bit different. And there's actually whole different disciplines of dog training that are designed for very strong working breeds, very dominant breeds, very driven breeds. And so I don't necessarily think they gave the Monks of New Skeet a fair assessment, because they definitely are pretty knowledgeable and they have helped a lot of people with their animals over the years.
Well, I think my take on that was they didn't really give them an assessment. It was more just kind of a it was more just kind of opinion, which again is fine, but it was painted in a certain light, which even that would be fine because again, people have their opinions on stuff, and that's of course, I mean, it's normal, but
It's
when
human.
you it's human, but when you take it upon yourself to bring it up in such a big podcast, we need you to be even, present each side as it is. And so I understand what you're getting at there. I just wanted to clarify. They didn't really talk too much. I mean, they didn't really say much about them. They just said that they were like monks who bred and trained dogs, but there wasn't much of an assessment. Um,
Right. And they were alluding a little bit to the fact that, because they preach dominance and alpha leadership and alpha male, alpha female, in essence is because I guess they have literature and they've been published, given this stuff. I don't know if they're probably alluding to that they're kind of part of the problem. Uh,
yeah, I mean, there's definitely inference. There's lots of inference in like just even certain jokes and things. And again, I'm not going to really waste too much time on it. People are smart. They would listen to it and kind of get what we're saying. So
yeah,
with that
yeah,
being said, I want to get into a little more of the substance of it. So
yeah,
when we talk about techniques of dominance theory as they laid them out, they were talking about things like the alpha roll. We kind of take the dog and like flip them over. There was like the pinning a dog down on its side and kind of holding it down until they give up. And uh,
mhm,
they were talking. I forgot what they called it, but like you hold the dog by the jowls and kind of
yeah.
like shake them and like
That was
stare at each other.
a scruff shake. That was
Yeah,
actually
right. A scruff shake. They also talked about some stuff though that like balance training, does sort of implement into its overall like technique, like leash corrections. They were talking they kind of, mentioned very briefly like choke chains, pinch collars, e-collars, and
yeah.
my big issue was they kind of skimmed right past that, but they clung onto the alpha part a little bit longer, and they
Yeah,
they
and they
did
made
kind of
they made dog training tools part of a dominance movement, right? And they kind of put this really yeah, it sucks that they put certain tools into a mindset movement. So, it's kind of cool.
yeah, and it's just I, I wasn't a huge fan of how they were saying like they it was like 3 or 4 times throughout the podcast. I tried to keep count because I listened to it a good like 3 or 4 times. And
Mhm.
it was about 3 or 4 times throughout the podcast that they would make it a point to express that like, listen, these things they may actually get results, but
Mhm.
at what cost essentially is what they were kind of
Yeah.
alluding to. And they were making jokes that like basically you like bully your dog into submission and then he just dies inside. So like he
Mhm.
stops jumping, but it's only
Mhm.
because he now hates his life.
Right.
Which I'm not being hyperbolic. Anybody who listens to
Yeah.
this, please, I encourage you to listen to that one too, and make sure that I'm being fair. And if I'm not, call me out. I really, in any sort of context, anywhere, anytime, I'm always a huge fan of like come with what's really being said, and hold me to that same standard. That's totally okay. But listen to it. They talk with basically that exact same verbiage.
Right. No, I remember them actually saying stuff like that. And so I guess let's talk about what is at stake here, right? Like what are they comparing? They're talking about dominance versus positive reinforcement, and how these are two almost polar opposite thought processes. Um, And so dominance training, in their definitions, is a very physical, aggressive technique that focuses on impugning your dog to create some form of hierarchy. So in essence, your dog learns their place, right? So it's kind of this tyrannical look at dog ownership, right? So two things that they pull from dominance training is like, the mindset of people who subscribe to dominance training is they constantly think that their dog is some type of tyrant who is trying to fuck them before they get fucked, right?
Right.
So it's pretty much like they're trying to control you so that you don't control them, and it's a battle of of the fittest between the two of you guys to figure out who's in charge and who's not in charge. Um, which to me is kind of like a very it is true. I definitely met people of this mindset. But to me, it's kind of like a funny, cartoonish, like description of dominance dog training, because to me, I've been doing this for a while, and it's like this was stuff that we did like about 15 years ago, and so maybe I guess the public understanding hasn't really caught up, which is totally normal. But yeah, so that's one side of it, and then the other side of it is the positive reinforcement side. What was your take on the positive reinforcement descriptions?
Well, my take on the positive reinforcement description was interesting because it was very accurate.
Hmm.
And I mean, it felt like they definitely did a lot of research on that front because they were even using the lima, the least intrusive, minimally aversive, like phrasing that pure positive trainers use. And so I was like, okay, they even talk about like clicker training and how to appropriately mark certain things and reward with food. And
Hmm.
it felt very much like they did their research. And I'm sure some of it has to do with the fact that I think they both have two dogs apiece,
Hmm.
and or at least two dogs because they both talk about like two dogs apiece. And they both make it clear in their podcast that they're both definitely more fans of positive training. So maybe that's just the training they've done with their dogs, so they're just more knowledgeable because they've done it.
Right.
Um, but when it came to the balance training, it was more like Game of Thrones, like kill you before you is like
Yeah.
it. I agree with you that it was a more so I'm not going to harp on it because you said it perfectly, but I agree with you that it was kind of cartoony. But the only other thing I would add to it is even the fact that they use that weird fringe ideology that maybe still exists here and there, but is by no means the mainstream. Like when you're putting up positive training, which is huge right now. I think the biggest dog trainers on YouTube right now are like Zach Jordan, some other guys that are all positive guys, and
Right.
it's definitely the big thing right now. The other big thing right now was not dominance training. My dog is out to get me.
Right.
Right.
Right. And it's so funny because I remember in like the first minute of the podcast, they talk about how they do have dogs, and they also talked about how both of their dogs aren't well behaved. And
Oh, yeah.
I just thought it was kind of interesting, because this is a concept that like a lot of dog owners struggle with, right? It's like we want to subscribe to an ideology, right? We want to subscribe to positive reinforcement or something that seems like fair, equal treatment, right? And we kind of see this evolution through like mankind as well. It's like back in the 50s and 60s when like military and the world wars and all that stuff were huge, like this militant look at child raising, this militant look of how a household should be run, the militant school at how schools should be run, right? And over the years, that kind of has evolved to become more balanced, to become more empathetic, more compassionate, more thoughtful. Back in the day, if you had autism, you'd get put in not even in a special class, you get a dunce cap on your head. Nowadays there's whole special schools and programs and things associated to it. So people are, in essence, over the years are getting smarter. And to their point, they said, 20, 30 years ago, this was the mainstream. And I would agree, people are getting smarter, but I guess the point I want to make with this is there was such a huge correction from this dominance training movement that people went completely the other direction to an idealistic way of training dogs. And my experience in training dogs is, not always are ideals practical in certain circumstances, right? So we'll get into that a little bit more later, but I guess they they subscribe to the positive reinforcement movement, but not necessarily have either prefer their own, discipline or their own hard work that they put in with their dogs. That there's also no a lot of people who subscribe to that. There's also going to be limits to their success that they find as well.
They let go of one extreme for another. So positive reinforcement is great. It's definitely alive and well in all aspects of training. At least I would hope so.
Yeah.
Pure positive is where they're they like let go of one emotional fallacy that is you need to like dominate your dog for another, which is you can never say no. I heard them saying that a little bit too. And they
Right.
kind of tied it in with kids a bit, like even, saying no or using this word, that word. You
Hmm.
shouldn't say bad, you should say unfavorable, you should. And
Hmm.
it's these are the things that all we want, Brent and I, and people like us, dog trainers, any dog trainer, pure positive or not, we may have different understandings of the science, or maybe we've come to different conclusions, which is natural of anything, but all of us want is to create the absolute best outcome with the least amount of time, resistance, like resource on the owner's part. And that's why we bother to have these conversations, because it's not about going after some guys, who aren't dog trainers and they don't necessarily deserve like a huge amount of criticism, but it's just for everything there needs to be that sort of counterbalance. And dominance training was wrong. It was absolutely there was so much of it that was incorrect, but pure positive, never saying no. In my
Hmm.
opinion, there's a lot of stuff that's left out of that too. And so we're kind of coming into the middle, and what they should have brought to the table of this argument was modern ideals of balanced dog training, where you absolutely
Yeah.
believe in food work, but
Yeah.
corrections and saying no, they do have their place. They do have their moments where they're efficient, maybe even more so than food. And I wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit about. I know you brought up B.F. Skinner, and
Hmm.
they brought him up in such a way, to suggest that he made it absolutely clear that positive reinforcement was the single most effective way to train a dog.
Right.
And so anybody who does something other than that is just doing something that's not as efficient. So in a sense, you're wasting your time to a degree. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. So yeah, B.F. Skinner is the father of a movement called behaviorism, where pretty much the theory was everything that humans do at some point in our life were programmed, right? And this later got brought into, animal psychology and animal training techniques and things like that. And so he was the guy that created the positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, all that stuff. Um, they also made a funny comment about B.F. Skinner where they mentioned about putting kids in boxes with electrical plates on it. He actually never did that. They're confusing two different experiments, but I won't get into that. BF Skinner, you have your own legacy. um he wasn't a child electrocutor, that's the bottom line. But okay, so what was the question again? I completely lost it. What
Here
was it?
was here was my question.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear you riff on the idea that they didn't, which was they talked about how positive reinforcers are the most effective way, in their
Mm,
words, to train a dog. I
right.
just want you to add the context around that there should be.
Well, they also made another statement. They said that negative or that positive punishment is the worst
Right, right,
way
right,
to train a dog, right? So
right.
they made two bold statements in this. And I guess the context of it is if we just add the simple phrase to train new behaviors, then they are completely accurate, right? So for example, food work, positive reinforcement is the easiest way to motivate a learner to cycle through different options to figure something out faster because there's something at the end of the tunnel that they want, right? Um, so using food or using something that is would be considered positive is the fastest way to get a learner to learn something. On the other side of that spectrum, positive punishment is the worst way to teach new behaviors because what it does is it forces the learner to try and learn something from a process of elimination, right? So let's say, I show up to work and I log into my computer. And as soon as I click on one window, a buzzer goes off and electrocutes my chair. And I go, ooh, every time I open this window, I get electrocuted. So maybe I try it again just to see if it was an accident. And I learned through the process of elimination, okay, maybe I shouldn't open that window on my computer. Right. So I open another one and nothing happens. So now I learned that maybe I should do that. So definitely from a learning new behavior standpoint, positive reinforcement is the better choice. Negative reinforcement is, or positive punishment is the worst way to learn behaviors. And in dog training school, we actually run that experiment so that people understand it very, very well. We run a lot of operant conditioning simulations in dog training school.
Yeah, I think that's what I took issue with was there wasn't the context around it to kind of make it a full understanding of what B.F. Skinner had learned. And
Right.
I just want to kind of put a bit of a fine point on this just so that we're clear. Marking is what they marking behaviors, that is. They were talking about a clicker, but you can do this with or without a clicker. They explained that perfectly. It was beautiful, it was great. Um, Marking behaviors, I would 100% agree, is absolutely essential to proper dog training, and I
Mhm.
think it's something that might even be overlooked to an extent that's borderline unacceptable, like, depending on where you go, different owners, different trainers, they all kinda get it, but, like, proper timing of markers and reinforcers in that order can take a dog that you can teach a dog something in like half the time if you make minor tweaks to your timing of things. And so when they were talking about marking things with the clicker, they were talking about a sit, that as soon as the dog sits, you click the little clicker and then you give him some food so that he understands, oh, when I hear this sound I get food, but I don't hear this sound until my little butt hits the ground. And therefore, they A plus B equals C, and they start putting these things together. And that, same could be said for down and whatever else you're trying to teach a dog. But
Right.
even without clicker training, verbal markers are just the same. you know,
Right.
you you have a marker, yes, good, whatever the case. I say sit, dog's little butt hits the ground. I go good, food.
Right.
Dog understands. Oh, whoa! When I do things that he wants and he marks with good, I know what good means.
Right. Right.
But
Right.
markers go the other way too. If my dog does something I don't want, I can mark that too. No,
Right.
and it's just as effective. And
Right.
I really want people to understand this because how many dogs, Brent, have you trained personally, or me, or together, and
Hmm.
that they've they've done a certain type of training? Not that it's like inferior in any way, because it's not. I'm a huge fan of food work, but it's just not always the best thing for every single dog. So it's good to have a healthy mixture, and it's
Right.
good as a trainer to be versed in the different approaches to training. But how many dogs in your experience have gone through like positive training and still need a little help with, some sort of training collar, and then finally the owners get what they're looking for?
A bunch, like hundreds and hundreds, like so many times we run into dogs who get trained by, let's say, a positive, positive only methods. And people have spent, hundreds, thousands of dollars on, again, this format of training, which again, it's great and ideal, but sometimes with certain behaviors and thought process, and most importantly, the duration of time, right? There are some dogs whose behaviors are so has so many layers to them that it would take 12 to 15 sessions to start seeing significant changes in that dog's behavior. And unfortunately, not everyone has that type of budget. Not everybody has that type of time to be able to have to do that, right? So many times, and sometimes what happens is they come to me in, with the title untrainable, right?
Mm.
So many times clients have been like, I've been to 2-3 dog trainers, or I've had 4 or 5 sessions with a person, and I go, so you've had 4 or 5 sessions, what have you learned? And they go, well, the dog knows how to look at me, the dog knows how to sit, the dog knows how to stay. And I said, well, what's your biggest problem? And they go, well, the dog's still pulling on a leash, right? Or they say, my dog is still growling, or my dog is still fighting other dogs, or whatever it might be. And, it's very obvious for, as a balanced dog trainer, to think like, okay, well, what's missing is the dog doesn't know what you expect and don't expect from him. The dog doesn't know what you like or dislike from him. So, unfortunately, what tends to happen with positive only dog training is the dog kind of is a little bit oblivious to knowing what you dislike, right? Or what the consequences are to wrong decisions. And again, the consequence of wrong decisions doesn't necessarily mean aggression physicality, being mean, being painful, anything like that. It just needs the dog needs to know what their handler or their owner will do when a wrong decision is given, and whether that is taking something away, whether that is showing some form of opposition, it has to be taught to them. So many times we make huge turnarounds with dogs simply just by adding what I call control in dog training, right? So dominance is one thing. Dominance is, to me, at least the way that they were perceiving it, is like trying to belittle the dog and trying to break the dog's spirit to a point where he's almost scared to have any natural thought, right, without your permission. But control, or my definition of dominance, is always, do you even have influence over your dog? Like, does your dog give a shit about what you have to say, think, or what you want? Right. And so if you don't have influence over your dog, then you don't have control over your dog. And if you don't have control over your dog, then pretty much you are your dog's butler. Like, you feed them, you take them places, you walk them, you clean their shit up, you do all this stuff. And in your relationship, and we always have to make sure our job as dog owners is to take the role of their parents, right? We're the ones responsible for their outcome. We're the ones responsible for their behavior. Anything that your dog does wrong is a complete and direct correlation to you, right? And what you have and haven't trained your dog to do. And there are some behaviors that are harder to teach than others. However, there is no excuse, even though dominance training has been debunked. And yes, you shouldn't pin your dog. You should never get in a physical fight with an animal. That's obvious, because there's only one result that's going to happen if you get in a physical fight with an animal. And that's usually they're going to bite you at some point, right? You get in a physical fight with something, they're going to get in a physical fight with you back.
Yeah, or
But
they
that
should. If you get in a physical fight with
or
them,
they
they should
or
bite
they
your ass.
should. Yeah, if you physically hurt them, the likelihood of them turning around and biting you and snapping at you is going to be very high. But that being said, there is no excuse for us not taking a significant leadership role for our dogs. There
Right.
is no excuse of just being passive with especially very urgent things, right? If your dog is lunging or has the intention to hurt something or kill something or threaten something, there is no reason why we can't take immediate action on those things, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't make logical sense sometimes.
and that's a big thing too that they I think one of the bigger misunderstandings that these guys had was they got this part right. Reactivity oftentimes is fear-based. And I do agree with them that people should understand this a bit more clearly, that if a dog is reacting to something unfavorably, it's probably in one form or another. I mean, there are other reasons that a dog could be reactive, but let's say the dog is reactive out of fear. Like he was talking about one of his personal dogs that was good around other dogs and then got attacked at a dog park or something like that, and then wasn't good around other dogs after that. So he just didn't bring them around other dogs, which I think is totally practical. I can understand that and I have no issue with
Hmm.
that. But
Hmm.
I want to make clear from a training perspective. They hammered home the idea a little bit about it's not right to correct a dog for being afraid. You can't correct fear out of a dog, which I completely agree with. I don't really know of anybody that would disagree with that.
Right.
Um,
No.
Here's the problem though. If a dog is either afraid or nervous or whatever the case, whether it's fear based or not, the emotion itself is not necessarily something you can just very directly dictate, but the
Hmm.
action as to whether or not they decide to indulge in that emotion, that is
Hmm.
something that they can control at least to a hefty extent. So that's to say, if I have a dog, let's say his dog was good with other dogs, was attacked, now it's not. If we were to
Right.
take his dog out and his dog sees another dog, the dog has every right to be nervous about another dog. I mean, of course, you can't correct a dog for that.
Right.
But if the dog outwardly decides to take that emotion and make it real with reacting, let's say lunging, barking, that kind of thing, that was a conscious decision made by the dog, which of course he's not like, I'm not suggesting that he's like a super genius that should know what's going on. That's why trainers exist so that we can teach them better. But to that extent, how the dog feels is one thing, but as humans, as trainers, as owners, it's largely our job to not let them indulge in the things that aren't good for them. They bring up fear. but they don't. They seem to get confused by the idea that if the dog's already afraid, it's not exactly very nice of you to just let the dog stay afraid of things. You can
Right.
help them work past fear. And so I just want to be clear about that. You're not correcting a dog for an emotion, but you're correcting them for the decisions that they make regardless of the emotion, because they also talked about positive emotion. They talked about, if I come home and my dog's excited, he's going to jump, and I kind of turn my
Hmm.
back to him, and it's the same concept. The dogs can be excited. My dogs get excited to see me every time I go and you play with them, but you
Right.
know, even though you're emotionally heightened, you still have a list of expectations that I need you to adhere to, and it's because they're for your own good.
Right, right. And I guess that's also to bring up context too. I think it's a lot of dog trainers, as they mentioned, agree that, when dogs show aggression, they're fearful, but not necessarily are they fearful for good reasons, or a lot of times that fear is just fear of the unknown. Like they're ignorant. So because they're ignorant to the circumstance, or they don't know what to do, then it kind of manifests itself as defensiveness, which very easily can turn into aggression. So it's yes, dog do show aggression off of fear, but sometimes it's fear that is just due to lack of exposure, lack of experience, and lack of guidance. So like a lot of our job is to guide them through appropriate ways of acting, right? The same way our parents would, if we were rude in public, our parents' job was to say, "Hey, you're being rude. Say you're sorry and apologize," right? Like we were supposed to show some type of, um, appeasement and apologize to whatever the will of our parents were. So there is wiggle room there when it comes to fearful dogs showing aggression.
Yeah, 100%. And I wanted to get last time we talked about this, you explained this in a way that I liked a lot. So, you know, if you guys aren't kind of getting the gist of it, whenever I feel like Brent explains things better, I just let him do it because it's better.
Thanks, man.
So we were talking about the idea of extinction. They talked about extinction, and extinction, for those who haven't yet heard the other podcast, is in pure positive training. You can absolutely reinforce what you want by rewarding, because of course dogs like reward, so they're going to be more likely to do the thing that earned them that reward.
Hmm.
Extinction is the exact opposite of that, without offering any sort of positive punisher. You're not giving a verbal no, you're not correcting in any sort of way, but what you are doing is taking away what a dog likes, which is of course your attention, your affection. And so it would look something like this. You walk in the house, dog jumps on you, so you just turn away from them, you don't look at them, you don't say anything to them. You just give them the absolute cold shoulder, and the dog goes, "Hey, what the hell?"
Hmm.
And so they stop, they sit down, because it's not that exciting to engage with someone who's not paying attention to you, so they just don't. At which point they've stopped, so they sit. So now you go and play with them. If they do it again, you stop again and keep that going until the dog understands, every time I jump on this guy, he just kind of turns away from me. So maybe
Hmm.
I should stop. That's extinction. The dog is learning to naturally let go of this habit because it doesn't serve them.
Right.
But you challenge this idea when the primary reinforcer isn't necessarily the person who's trying to extinct the behavior, or
Yeah.
whatever the verb for that is.
Yeah, exactly. Extinguish or something. I
There
don't
you
know.
go. Yeah, that's probably
Um,
better.
so yeah, so here's a common example where you see some dog trainers go wrong. So let's say I have a dog who likes to bark at people who walk in front of our house. Right? Dog has a front seat access to the front of my house window, and anytime someone's walking a dog or there's a mailman or something, the dog is barking. Um, and the idea is the dog barks, the dog scares someone away. The dog, in his mind, he feels that he is protecting the house, right? And that works. When people try and use extinction on, like, just let's say that circumstance, the idea of that, if your dog is barking, say nothing, right? Because normally, what's the alternative? Dog is barking, and you're going, "Shut up, Rover! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up, Rover." And then maybe your dog might look at that as, "Oh, look, Dad's joining along. Dad's also barking. So he must be supporting what I'm doing. Yay, me for barking." Right. Um, the other idea would be, all right, if my dog is barking, which is the undesirable behavior, that we're going to go ahead and ignore that undesirable behavior. And the moment the dog shuts up, we're going to say, "Yay, good boy," and mark that moment and say, "Good dog," because quiet is what we wanted at that time. Right. So that's ultimately, we're trying to teach the dog that silence is what gets us excited. But the problem with this type of logic is that we're not looking at what the purpose or the agenda of the barking is. In the scenario where a dog is barking at a mailman or someone walking in front of your house, the simple reinforcement has nothing to do with you. The reinforcement to the behavior is actually your dog barks at what he considers to be intruder in front of your property. That intruder keeps walking away from the house, which in your mind, which in your dog's mind, he thinks he scared the person away, which reinforces the behavior of barking the next time. So this is what we call a positive feedback loop. We've talked about it in other episodes before.
Mhm.
Um, but the idea is your dog barks, your dog scares someone away, quote unquote, and that fuels the dog for next time to bark even louder, even stronger. So in that scenario, to say nothing to your dog or to not distract your dog or redirect your dog or give your dog any type of direction is a little bit of a ludicrous process, because that behavior in and of itself would exist whether you were home or whether you weren't home, right? So
A
it
lot of
has
times
nothing to do with you.
yeah, and a lot of times, even when people do try to market with a no, or, but they don't necessarily reinforce properly, the dog can
Yeah.
still do it because when we talk about a positive feedback loop, a self-reinforcing behavior, essentially you're battling with something that's so innate with the dog is, I'm protecting my home, I'm protecting my family. This guy walked by, I barked at him, he went away. I knew I was right. I scared him away. I knew it. So
Hmm.
you're dealing with something that's pretty powerful in terms of influence over the dog's mentality. So a lot of times I see this kind of thing. People say no to their dog, and I always ask them like, well, does he know what no is? Have you ever worked a very clear understanding of what the dog should do instead, or So that's definitely something that I see often, and it was worth us pointing out. Um, again, a lot of it just has to do with proper marking of what it is that you want or don't want. That could be verbal, that could be hand signals, that could be whatever the case. Verbal being, of course, I think our favorite because it's just the most versatile. You don't have to be like too
Hmm.
close to the dog,
Hmm.
or even like in sight. I can tell my dog no, even if I'm like in the bathroom and he's barking at the door because like the DoorDash
Right.
guy got here early. Um, but you mark something and then you reinforce it appropriately. If it's something that you want, if you're shaping new behaviors, you mark it with good or with yes, and then you give the dog some food, give the dog some praise because they earned it because they're learning things.
Right.
But if they do something that you don't want, but that here's a clear thing that I want to make sure that people understand. The dog has to know already, has to already completely understand the behavior that they're doing and that you don't want them to do it. I'm
Right.
not a big fan of people who correct dogs for things before having taught the dog what to do either instead or before very, very clearly, excuse me, having marked it
Hmm.
in a way that doesn't include corrections just yet. But
Right.
they're handy. When you need to discourage a certain behavior that isn't necessarily reinforced by you, so you can't just extinguish it yourself,
Hmm.
it's very handy going after these sort of positive feedback loops.
Right. Right. Exactly. I always kind of say, I have a direct, redirect, and then correct. Right. It's kind of like this sequence where I'm going to direct the dog in what I call a constructive reprimand. That coin was termed by Ian Dunbar. Constructive reprimand means tell the dog to do something he already knows how to do in
Hmm.
replacement of a behavior. So I
Hmm.
direct the dog. If for any reason that doesn't work, I'll redirect that dog's attention, redirect that dog's focus to something else, to see if I can get his mind off of it. But at the very end, if that does not work, then I have to correct the dog and let him know that that is not an option anymore, what you're doing or what you're trying to do. So there is a chance we want to teach the dogs to make decisions and understand, kind of like when we're kids, it's like you have a 3 strike rule, right? Some parents live by a 3 strike rule where you do it once, do it twice, do it the third time, you're in trouble, right? Um, but systems like that where we allow the dog chances to think, we allow the dogs chances to fail, so that way they learn certain concepts faster. And I think that is a more balanced way of dealing with certain behaviors.
100%. So I think we're getting pretty close to the end of it here. I don't really
Yeah.
have too many more points to bring up. Do you?
No, I think we're really good. I think we're really good.
Can I just say, before we close out here, I wanted to make sure that we encourage anybody listening to this because the Dog Trainers podcast was designed and is largely geared toward, to the best extent that we can anyway, newer dog trainers, novice dog trainers, and dog owners who are really interested, but mostly people who are really kind of in the know and want to make sure that they understand the importance and the value of every single different methodology, their ups and downs, because it's our job to know these things. And with that being said, these conversations, when you talk about certain ideologies, they're good to have. They're healthy to debate ideas. I'll never discourage that as a concept, dog training or not. Just make sure that you come to the conversation in good faith with honest premises about the two sides or the however many sides you're discussing. When it comes to this podcast in particular, I think that Chuck and Josh did a great job. We really enjoyed their podcast. Um, I want to make absolutely clear that any sort of like passion or or annoyance or whatever that you may have gotten from us if you ever hear this, it's just
Hmm.
because we care as much as you do, and we just want to make sure that people have helpful information because we want dogs to be as happy and healthy just like you. We're all on the same side here, and if you guys ever were interested in having a conversation with us, we'd love it. There's no
Yeah,
bad blood here. We just want to make sure that that's clear.
of course, of course. This is all about education, helping the dogs. All right, guys. Thank you guys so much for checking out episode 9 of the Dog Trainers podcast. My name is Brent Labrada, and that guy is Mariano Alvarez. We'd love to hear from you guys and answer any questions that you guys would like to have answered. Go ahead and email us at dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com with any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend. We'll see you next time.